Hello guys! Welcome back to Rajasmeca. It's Marco here, and today we speed paint a 20 model unit using color theory to make the work quick and super effective. If you are new to the channel or to this series, where I'm painting the backbone of my Kruleboyz army using the models in the Dominion box, I strongly suggest you start from the first video of this playlist to have a more comprehensive overview of my process. I painted all this stuff in the same weekend, everything is part of the same visual plan, and all my choices are connected and layered on each other. So consider the episodes as steps of the same general workflow and complementary aspects of my speed painting philosophy. I call the unit Those Yellow Bastards, because I can't look at them without thinking to Sin City and to That Yellow Bastard. And the whole paint job took me about 5 hours of work. Even painting large and visually uniform projects like armies, I believe in using the best tool for every specific situation. The process I used here is completely different from the one I used on the Orc Boys, and chosen considering the large number of models and their smaller size. But it tends to the same vibe of old school fantasy with a touch of grimdark and Lord of the Rings aesthetic. And thanks to a careful use of color theory and composition, to a coherent look when the different units are fielded next to each other on the table. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button to always know what happens on the channel. And if you want to support my work, like, comment, share, watch another video, and maybe check my Patreon page, where you can find the real-time footage of my videos, with every single little line and brushstroke. Thanks a million, guys! Considering only the sculpts, this is one of those paint jobs that I usually tackle starting directly with a colored primer. The small size of these models doesn't need the extreme value jump between black and white to create the contrast of their tiny volumes, but it needs a good chromatic and temperature contrast to make the small shapes more interesting and better defined. So I usually tend to skip a step and move directly to colors. In this particular case, I need a good coat of black on my bases to create their own internal scheme and contrast, and it's simply quicker to cover everything in black. But if you are in a hurry and you are working with less demanding bases, you can move directly to the next step. And this is where the process starts diverging from the one I used on the Orc Boys. Yeah, they basically have in common only the black primer. The work on the Gut Reapers is all about transparency effects and the overlapping of translucent tones, while here everything is based on the layering of opaque colors. In the first episode, I move from extreme lights to the shadows, while here I invert my perspective, working from shadows to lights, simply because it's more efficient on these specific models. I consider this step as my true priming stage, but since I have a coat of black in place, I'm not going to waste it. And even if its contribute will be extremely subtle, I incorporate new information in my layering, using it as an extra source of contrast. I spray from above to start setting the same simple environmental light I created on the Orc Boys with a black and white sketch. But this step technically represents my shadows, so a good amount of blue reaches also the lowest and most hidden parts. I know what you're thinking. But Marco, you handsome devilish madman, why the hell are you covering them in blue if you want a yellow color scheme? Ooh, a good question with multiple answers. As I mentioned before, my priority here is to set the most powerful chromatic contrast possible between lights and shadows, because even if value contrast is always one of the main and most powerful kinds of contrast, I cannot rely too much on it on these tiny surfaces and small volumes, and I want to keep more extreme value jumps for larger models to render better their virtual size. So blue becomes an obvious choice, because it's yellow complementary tone and a powerful source of contrast. Next step is a zenithal coat of orange to start building up the transition to its final yellow hue. I use Molotov paints for these steps because they are absolutely perfect for the airbrush straight from the bottle. They are completely opaque, so they quickly set a new layer, preventing optical mixes with the previous colors. And they are extremely matte, so my finish remains coherent and easy to read. But let's dig a bit deeper. This is one of those tricky armies that have a strong cohesive theme, but don't have a strong cohesive look. Different races and subspecies are mixed together, each one with his own phenotype, equipment, and visual storytelling. And these differences are enhanced even more by the feral, chaotic nature of this force. The choice of my colors is functional to my synthesis of the environmental light in which the army is standing. That's my major source of uniformity for such a non-uniform collection. Putting it in simpler terms, if I can't rely on the models and their color scheme, I use the environment to create uniformity, grounding every figure in the same visual setting. Rewatching the previous video with this idea in mind, you'll instantly notice that my shadows tend to saturated cold tones, and my lights move to the saturated warm lights. And here I'm using the same concept, with different tools and techniques, to simulate the same environmental light and setting. Blue and yellow are more obvious cold and warm tones, but I'm particularly careful in using a proper cold blue. And in the next steps, you'll see me actively work to keep the yellow into the warmer side of its spectrum. With this layer in place, you can understand better where the process is going. Time for a nice coat of powerful yellow to complete the basic transition. Every new layer is a smaller and smaller zenithal application of lighter lights, so you must be careful in keeping a bit of every stage to generate a progressive and smooth modulation. I created this visual movement in 3 steps, and you probably already noticed that my progression is unbalanced towards orange and yellow, with a big chromatic hole here in the red-magenta spectrum. I still want that kind of sensations, but I'll add them later and with different tools to create a specific effect. I quickly re-establish the green scheme of the bases with an opaque zenithal coat of a dark natural green, followed by a lighter lime green. Working on the orcs, I can just use the same green I have in the airbrush while painting the skins, but here the bases are their own independent step. And I use white ink to bring back the rocks to the state of an empty canvas. That will be useful later to recreate the same look I use on the orcs, using oil washes on the organic textures of the bark. I use the same white also to add an extra desaturated light on the highest parts of the yellow skin. This step gives me an extra value jump, and declare the saturation coherent with my environmental light. The yellow becomes a bit colder on those spots, but I'll get back that warmth later with the oil filters. And here is the magenta sensation we were talking about. I moved it here without layering it with the basic colors for a couple of valid reasons. I want this tone to be clearly visible, and to be an important turning point to the warm tones of the lights. So, to enhance its presence, I prefer to apply it on top of the basic transition, using it also to correct and soften the areas where I feel the layers are a bit too obvious. The other one is purely pragmatic. Working with different types and brands of paint in the airbrush at the same time can create problems, involuntary mixes of tones and finishes, and this makes quick color changes in the cup slower and less efficient. So I used my opaque colors and inks in 2 separate blocks. I use Contrast Blood Angels Red for a quick, powerful, saturated coverage on the little ropes of the heraldry. And Rage Brown from the Scale 75 Instant Colors for a softer effect on the other straps of their simple equipment. Time for a super fun step. You have already seen in action my metallic contrast paints, and I know that you have already made some experiments with them. So it's time to add new ideas and more advanced concepts about their use and their true potential. I prepare 2 mixes in 2 separate pots. The ingredients are the same, but in the first one I add much more black and brown to obtain a darker and more saturated tone. Here you can see the different colors on the white paper. Then I add an equal amount of fluid metallic silver, a bit of medium to stabilize the metallic pigments in the mix, and a good amount of airbrush thinner until I obtain this kind of transparency. Dilution for me is always dependent on the opacity I want to obtain, and this is a great way to show you the kind of translucency I want here. So why 2 tones? Well, these armors are very simple and geometric, and thanks to these flat planes, I can easily create the natural sensation of the different quantity of light they catch, bounce and reflect, simply using two different values of the same color. A lighter one for the panels facing up, or the main light, and a darker one for the others. It's of course an oversimplification of a very complicated phenomenon, but it quickly adds a ton of visual information to gaming models. This visual trick seems obvious at the beginning, but when you start having together all the elements of the armors with a coherent general facing, everything becomes more realistic and believable. Thanks to the fluid consistency of these mixes, even working on more organic shapes like the helmets is pretty easy, because the simple blocks of the applications merge wet on wet, and the transition becomes soft and smooth, still keeping the general sense of their geometry and volumes. If you paid attention to the first video, you noticed that on the orcs I used turquoise as base for the metallic mix, but here I used the proper blue. This because the orcs armor started from a black and white base, while here I'm working over a yellowish base, that in the optical mix brings my tone to the same turquoise blue-green sensations. Yep, color theory is everywhere. Time for a quick oil wash, and because of the simplicity of the scheme, I use only black and burnt umber. But precisely because of this simplicity, it's time to throw in some extra advanced concepts. First of all, I'm using student-grade oils because they have less pigments than artist-grade paints. So they grant me a similar load of pigments when the wash is concentrated in the recesses, but they have less impact and staining power, and they are easier to wipe off from the open surfaces, making this particular kind of wash even better for my main goal, that is dark definition. Timing and concentration are powerful tools. The first and second pool are the same mix of black and brown, but in the first one I added just a bit of white spirit. I applied the first dense mix on faces and fingers of every model, because I want these details to be strong and well defined. The mix have a higher load of pigments and literal concentration, and it stays on the model for a longer time, leaving a stronger and more precise mark. Then I apply the second, more transparent mix on all the other parts, as a light filter. And I use the pure brown only to wash the big skulls on the banners. I quickly wipe off the excess with makeup sponges, and in an instant I get a rich, smooth depth on every detail. The skin gets back a soft, natural warmth, made very realistic by the little amount of desaturation coming from the brown and the black. And all the tones are fused together in a seamless progression. Armors and equipment gets a subtle patina of rust and dirt, and every element becomes easy to read and super defined. Yeah, I love oil washes. Also, I'll never blame you if you call them done at this point, but I feel guilty if I don't add a bit of light definition to support all this beautiful dark definition. And I also want to add something extra to the metals. So, back to the palette. Thanks again to the small volumes, I can simplify and reduce my palette to just two opaque tones. Naples yellow, a warm, rich off-white for the extreme lights, and cadmium yellow for the darker, more chromatic highlights. At this point, you know the drill. It's all about micro applications in the upper parts of muscles and details, and wherever you feel the need of extra or more precise lights. And then blending these precise applications with a clean, dry, and in this case, quite small brush. The opacity of these colors is important, because I'm painting on top of all the other layers, and I need to leave visible marks that, even if blended with the rest, can clearly show their presence. These colors are so creamy and easy to spread that I don't even feel the need to thin them down, using them straight from the tubes. So in this stage there is absolutely no solvent involved. Application and blend. That's all. I'm quite happy with my metals, but in the lore this equipment comes directly from the Chaos Dwarfs, so I wanted to have something more, or at least different from the stuff used by the Orc infantry. So I use a light oil silver to add some powerful shiny edge highlights. Yep, using oil paints you can edge highlight even teeny tiny models with a big flat brush. I leave only a microscopic quantity of paint on the brush, unloading most of it on a piece of paper, almost like what we do for a dry brush. But here the paint is completely wet and active, and with a natural heavy body, so it can easily catch edges and details almost by itself. And here is the final result. 5 hours of work that could have been easily 3, if I had stopped the work before the highlights with oils. The step took me about 5 minutes for every model, but when you multiply the iteration for 20 models, that time starts to have a proper weight in the final balance. As always, experience and knowledge generate efficiency, and efficiency generates speed, so don't stress too much about this aspect. I want to point out again that even if I dissected their advanced planning and theoretical complexity, all the techniques used in this video are really that simple. So, especially now that you know their reasons and goals, don't be afraid to experiment, adding your own spin and ideas. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!